Hello, folks. Phil Gallagher of ThrabenU here for some more legacy content. People really enjoyed the top 8 matches with EronRelentless and decided to ask for some more. And so today I'm going to be covering 3 of the Swiss rounds, and we're going to see how he played in the other rounds and feature a couple more matches. While people really enjoyed the content, they were like, yeah, but it was all rug. Now, folks, I hate to tell you this, but there's really only a couple of truly viable top tier legacy decks right now. So if you're watching VODs of people playing in like challenges and showcase challenges and stuff like that, you're going to see a lot of Rug Delver and a lot of Snow. But I'll try to cover the matches that aren't necessarily those today, as well as one that I've sort of flagged as interesting. Um, Loco Kuko 1 recently donated some ticks towards me and said, hey, apply it towards legacy or vintage, whatever you want. So that donation is covering this stream. And here we go. If you enjoy this sort of content, please like, leave a comment, that sort of stuff, and help the channel grow, shooting to get to 3,000 subscribers sometime soon. The first round that I'm going to be covering today is round 4 versus Negator77, who is the current trophy leader by borderline in order of magnitude. So we know that he's going to be playing Rainbow Depths. Now, there's one thing that I want to sort of put into your mind before we even start looking at the gameplay, and that's the usage of Wasteland in this matchup. Death and Taxes has a very, very favored matchup versus the Depths deck. It has all of the things that Depths doesn't want to see. It has Wasteland, it has Caracas, it has Swords to Plowshares, and other things such as Flicker Wisp, which are relevant and disruptive. So Death and Taxes gets to attack it on a lot of the best fronts. But if you use your cards poorly or don't play around something correctly, you just die. So one of the biggest struggles in playing this matchup is trying to decide, when do I use my Wasteland? Is this a turn 1 Wasteland that is mana denial? Is this a Wasteland that I hold up for the entire game? Do I use this Wasteland to grab a combo piece now while it is still safe for me to do so? There's some really difficult questions here that don't necessarily have clear-cut answers. And so there will be a couple of times in this video where we can see just how tricky it is to make these decisions. And one of the things that compounds this is that Elvish Spirit Guide plus crop rotation at any given time can really result in things that look safe not actually being safe. Okay, we're going to go ahead and watch this replay now. Again, this is EronRelentless playing, who won the Legacy Showcase Challenge this weekend. Going to be watching this at 0.75 speed. Okay, so first let's evaluate the opening hand. Honestly, this opening hand is sick. It has an Ether Vial, it has a Wasteland. Both of those things in conjunction are pretty good. If you know you're playing against Depths, you can't necessarily just keep a hand that is just totally full of fair cards. You need something that is going to be interactive of some nature. And this hand has a Wasteland, which is what makes it keepable. Let's say this Wasteland was just another Plains. At that point, this hand is probably just too fair and would need to be mulliganed for this matchup. This Inquisition of Kozilek is going to take the Ether Vial and really decrease the power of the hand. Alright, now here is our first Wasteland situation. Do you use this Wasteland to just blow up a Mana Confluence? Mana Confluence into Inquisition of Kozilek would really signify that this is Turbo Depths, even if you weren't playing against the renowned Negator 77. So, knowing that, and seeing how little disruption is in this hand, it doesn't really make sense to just fire off the Wasteland as a mana denial element. Now, maybe things are different if you have a Thalia as a follow-up and you can really push that taxation angle hard, but this hand just cannot push that taxation angle. And that means in order to stay alive, this Wasteland probably needs to be held up the entire game. Now, that means probably not tapping out for a Stoneforge or a Spirit of the Labyrinth on turn 2 as well. All right, so now we see a Vampire Hexmage. This means that next turn, the opponent theoretically has a line where they can go and just put in a stage along with one piece of disruption of some kind, and that's that. All right. So things have now evolved a little bit. Now there is this Elvish Reclaimer in play. Why is this a problem? Well, Elvish Reclaimer can go and tutor up a wasteland. The wasteland can target this wasteland. And then if Aaron Relentless fires off the wasteland at, say, Dark Depths in response, Vampire Hexmage goes and eats this, and like that's that. The game is over. So this is incredibly threatening. All right. So why Ether Vial? Stoneforge Mystic and Spirit of the Labyrinth and Thalia all technically do things. But the problem right now is that the stuff that's going to beat him, they're already in play. So this play is playing towards the future world where he's still alive. It represents a Swords to Plowshares while also representing a wasteland that is active. Okay. So here, Aaron Relentless decides to go and get Stoneforge Mystic. Stoneforge Mystic can go and search for a Batterskull. And so, is this good? The idea is that Batterskull can go and gain the life necessary to make it so that he gets above 21. And once he's above 21, Merit Lodge doesn't kill in a single hit. However, the better question is, what percentage of the time does this actually work? So, a crop rotation here would mean that, say, this gemstone mine could be turned into a wasteland. Wasteland fires off at this, and the game ends. And there's also a bunch of lines that involve just Elvish Reclaimer being activated this turn, getting a wasteland. Wasteland fires off at Wasteland, Merit Lodge is created, and then the Batterskull doesn't actually get into combat at all before Merit Lodge makes that first connection and ends the game. So there's worlds where this play is good and fine, and it's probably okay to play towards this world since this also still represents Swords to Plowshares. But there is an alternate line where you just cycle silent clearing this turn, attempting to actually look for Swords to Plowshares. Because having a Swords to Plowshares or having a Caracas ultimately puts you in a safer position as this game goes a little bit longer. Then next turn, the Stoneforge can be put in off of the Vial, end of turn, not telegraphing to our opponent that this is a turn that they need to use discard. Okay. So there's a lot going on there. This is a matchup that is often hyped up as a great matchup for Death and Taxes, but as you can see, things are actually pretty damn complicated. All right, so indeed, one of the worst case scenarios has happened. The immediate crop rotation means that, well, and let's slow this down. So their wasteland targets our wasteland. Our wasteland targets their dark depths. The vampire hexmage targets the dark depths, and that means that they have won this war, and that results in 20 damage directly to the dome immediately instead of 20 damage in a following turn cycle. So this is a matchup that the Death and Taxes player will likely expect to win most of the time, and it does in fact get better in the post-board games, because you can trim a little bit of the fluff for extra removal spells like Path to Exile. Okay, so this is a really strong opening hand. It has 3 different pieces of mana denial, as well as 1 piece of removal. The Mother of Runes and Jitte are kind of like, whatever, but they serve different purposes. A Mother of Runes plus a flyer can stonewall a Merit Lodge as the game goes long, and one Jitte connection putting him to 21 life is kind of a big deal. The issue with the Jitte right now, though, is that Silent Clearing is the one white source that's here. So the Jitte connection represents 4 life. And if Silent Clearing is tapped on turns 1 through 4, then that doesn't actually put us above 20 the first time that we connect with Jitte, which is exceptionally awkward. Okay, so let's look at this draw for turn. The draw for turn is Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, which is theoretically a great draw when you have Fort, Wasteland, Wasteland. But what's the play this turn? Bomb is obviously going to attack. You're not super worried about anything getting Abrupt Decayed or anything like that. But what do you do after that? On the surface, you might think, choking my opponent's mana by playing Thalia is awesome, but is that actually a good line? The worst case scenario is that the opponent plays Dark Depths and Vampire Hexmage. And with the Urborg in play, that means that the opponent can just produce Merit Lodge on turn 2, and that avoids Thalia-based disruption. So Thalia is not really a good line. So the next question becomes, what's the follow-up play then if it's not Thalia? It could be holding up Wasteland, it could be using Rishadenport, it could be, any number of things. Probably not just slamming Jitte. I don't think I like that one. Let's see what EronRelentless decides to do. He has decided to snap off the Wasteland. Now, what does that gain? Snapping off the Wasteland means that something like a Dark Depths is no longer a mana-producing land. So in some cases, this ends up taking the opponent off of 2 mana for the turn. Now, why might this play make sense? This play could make sense because of the other Wasteland that is in hand. When you only have a single disruptive element, it doesn't make sense to really blow it early. But when you're sitting on multiple disruptive elements, it becomes more acceptable to use one of them as mana denial and one of them as a way to go and actually counter the combo. Okay, so we see the life gain source disappear here, and Thalia is the follow-up play. So the thing about Thalia here, though, is that if the opponent goes Dark Depths into Vampire Hexmage, we're kind of at the same position as in the previous turn cycle. But there is a key difference here. The opponent just goes turbos and makes this thing, then Swords to Plowshares exists this time around, and that means that the Merit Lodge is answerable. Is giving the opponent 20 life when you have 3 power on board ideal? No. But if you take that 2-for-1 there, it's probably going to end up being okay in the long term when you have so many relevant cards in this matchup. And that's why the decision is different than in the previous turn cycle. Okay, so now we see a Wasteland on the Urborg. Why do that now? Because in this turn cycle, the Urborg represents 2 mana, one from tapping to itself and one to tapping to Dark Depths. And what we learned in the previous turn cycle was that Negator 77 probably does not have Vampire Hexmage, because he had the opportunity to play that out and make a Merit Lodge directly if he wanted. So when we learn that he doesn't have Vampire Hexmage, that means that a stage is probably the way that he's likely to win. And taking Urborg out of play means that it takes an absolute crazy amount of mana to actually go and win this game here. Notably, you can consider Rishadan porting the Dark Depths here. In the odd world where Negator 77 does actually have a third Urborg, but I don't know if that's worth the point of life off of Silent Clearing or the potential of answering some sort of creature, like say an Elvish Reclaimer that is just played out in this turn cycle. And we see the concession here after successfully choking the mana. Notably, that entire game could have been played out very differently where Aaron Relentless just chooses to sit on a pile of wastelands for a long time. But he had the feel that attacking the Urborgs was something that was good to do, and it ended up working out. Okay, so this opening hand is pretty good. It has three different disruptive elements here. And although a discard spell can go and attack one of them, the wastelands afterwards are pretty strong. So this tutor goes and gets a Dark Depths. And okay, I was about to say, what that probably means is that this is going to be a game where, like, Wastelands are going to be sat on, and it's going to play a longer game, but it looks like he is choosing to attack the mana here. Seeing as he has one, two, three different disruptive elements still remaining in hand, that does make sense to me. This is a time where I might have considered not wastelanding and holding it up, but I can understand attacking the mana here. All right. Now, Dark Depths and Urborg are both in hand. The Urborg notably is going to make the Gemstone Mine much better. And a Stoneforge Mystic in this turn cycle fetches up a Batter Skull, which is going to potentially put him over 20 life, which is a huge deal with a Flicker Wisp around. But JK, not anymore. All right. So now this Batter Skull gets to go and hit play, and going to 24 will be absolutely huge with this Swords to Plowshares around and a Wasteland as well. The second Stoneforge Mystic here complicates things a little bit. This has the possibility to get an Umezawa's Jitte, which is yet another source of life gain. It also has the chance to get the sideboard card Sword of Feast and Famine in all likelihood. And protection from black and green means that smaller blockers aren't that big of a deal, and getting one card out of the opponent's hand each turn can be a pretty huge deal as well. All right, so that Abrupt Decay is just a tempo play that makes it so that a single activation isn't going to put them out of Merit Lodge range. All right, so there's a Vampire Hex Mage, and here is a Dark Depths. Now, Sylvan Safekeeper is a bit spooky here. Luckily, the Swords to Plowshares in response is very strong. What's happening is that Swords targets this, and if Negator 7/7 goes for just doing this, the Wasteland is here as backup. And this is kind of what I mean when I say the Death and Taxes deck has all of the tools necessary to win this matchup and so many different angles of interaction. But, say he didn't have mana up this turn, he dies. So you have to play conservatively. And this replay was 3 minutes and 10 seconds. And I have turned this into 17 minutes worth of content because it was so complicated, even though that many turns weren't actually played. Okay, now we're going to take a look at round 5 versus Elves, which is one of D&T's worst matchups, historically speaking. They just attack on angles that can largely ignore Thalia, and our disruption doesn't tend to do much against them. Let's go and see how this plays out. The initial opening hand here just has too much mana. Let's back that up just a touch, though. So this is the 7 cards that are presented on the so-called Molda 6. And he decides to scrap Recruiter of the Guard here, not knowing what the opponent is playing, which is kind of interesting. So the reason why you would make that decision is thinking that Thalia is often an important cards in many matchups, and if it is removed or thought seized, having a second one is kind of nice. But this does mean that if Thalia is not relevant in this matchup, this is actually a Mole to 5, not a Mole to 6. So I wouldn't, fault anyone for throwing back the second Thalia instead. The issue is that this hand only produces 2 mana, and you'd be keeping a hand that has 3 different 3-drops, which can be a little bit sketchy. So that's just the gut-wrenching feeling that you get playing Death and Taxes when your opponent plays an elf on turn 1 and you go like, "Oh, I probably lose this match no matter how well I play." So the play for this turn cycle is a Thalia, but unfortunately, as we can see, Elves is very good at ignoring Thalia, and this is just a turn 3 Goldfish from our opponent, where we didn't really play Magic. And this is how this matchup tends to go the vast majority of the time. The Death and Taxes player has to get a little bit lucky in order to do well. Alright, so this is a reasonable hand. If you're playing Death and Taxes and you're hoping to beat Elves, you really need to be keeping cards like Spirit of Labyrinth, Containment Priest, Grafdigger's Cage that have a high impact on the game relatively quickly. Okay, so EronRelentless has decided to make an attack in this turn for 3 damage, and the question I want to ask is, does this attack actually matter? What happens here if the opponent just blocks? So let's say they block with Elvish Reclaimer. Do you accept that trade, or do you protect with Mother of Runes? You protect with Mother of Runes, they bounce at Elvish Reclaimer with Wirewood Symbiote, and then they can go Blackland, Abrupt Decay, your Spirit of the Labyrinth, and potentially do cool things from there. There are worlds where you don't necessarily want to make this attack and you want to play it a little bit safer. The way that EronRelentless is going to win this game, if he wins, is by equipping Jitte to a creature, getting in there, and making sure everything is safe. And if Jitte doesn't work, there's a Sword of Fire and Ice as follow-up that can kind of serve the same role. So there's a lot of worlds where the opponent doesn't block here, but if the opponent does block and this mom has to tap, and then like there's removal as follow-up, things can get a little bit weird. The thing that complicates all of this, though, is that he's about to play a follow-up Stoneforge Mystic, which represents Jitte hitting the board and being active next turn. And if the opponent has 1 Abrupt Decay, it probably needs to be pointed at that Jitte, not at a creature. Meaning that it might be safer than it looks to make this attack at first glance. Okay, that was a lot of talk for 3 damage. Okay, so notably in sideboarding, Batterskull was boarded out, and Batterskull's sort of an interesting card in this matchup. I guess let me pause to talk about that for a second. So the Elves player most frequently wins by just glimpsing off or by casting Natural Order or a Green Sun for a Hoof, and those things just kill us dead. But in the games where that doesn't happen, things tend to drag on, and sometimes the opponent can just go wide of you and just attack in with a decent number of Elves for a few turns in a row. And sometimes having Batterskull as a tool in your toolbox that can help you gain some life is useful. EronRelentless instead has decided to go with 3 maybe more proactive pieces of equipment is probably a good way to phrase it in this matchup, where the Sword of Feast and Famine allows you to push damage, and the other 2 allow you to kill creatures. So he has not kept in tools that allow him to come back from behind in terms of life total. He's keeping tools that allow him to proactively win, and that's kind of how he's approaching the matchup here. Whether or not you keep Batterskull is often a function of how many sideboard cards you have for the matchup. For example, he has plenty of things like Mindbreak Trap and Grafdigger's Cage that he can bring in. Alright, here we see the Jitte. We are going to see the equipment onto Spirit of the Labyrinth, and then we see this creature getting pro-green and getting in there. So you might ask, hey, why do you want to put it on Spirit of the Labyrinth? Isn't that a relatively valuable creature? And the answer is, yes, it is. But what does the next turn cycle look like? The next turn cycle probably looks like playing a new Stoneforge Mystic, activating this current Stoneforge Mystic to put in Sword of Fire and Ice, and that lets you kill even more creatures in the next turn cycle. So that's the long-term plan, which is why you don't put it on a less valuable creature here. Jitte taking out two different creatures here is pretty hot, and luckily the opponent just passed the turn. Okay, what do you think of this attack? I don't like this attack. So, what the opponent could have done here is blocked with Dryad Arbor, and then activated one of the Elvish Reclaimers to cycle the Dryad Arbor away, and that prevents Jitte counters from happening in this turn cycle. Not tapping the Mom is a function of wanting to protect the Spirit of the Labyrinth that's in play, and I understand that. But since there is now another Spirit of the Labyrinth in hand, if you lose this Spirit of the Labyrinth to, say, an Abrupt Decay, I don't really think that's the end of the world. You have another Spirit of Labyrinth, you have another piece of equipment in the back burner here. So I might have gone ahead and gone with the protection from green in this turn cycle and just guaranteed that the Jitte counters happen. Now, the Jitte counters can be slightly less useful than on a lot of other boards. If we take a look at the graveyard here, there's one land in the graveyard. There's another land that can be in the graveyard at any time, and the Elvish Reclaimers represent a couple more lands getting into the graveyard as well. So these can get out of range of being killed by Jitte quickly. All right. So we see a Stoneforge Mystic here. Going to pick up a new piece of equipment. And then we're going to see Rishadenport being held up for Gaia's Cradle. All right, that's just going to get a fetch land to help grow the Elvish Reclaimers. And that fetch land gets put out of play immediately for a Cabal Pit to help answer some of these creatures. And the opponent just packs it in here. The opponent might have been able to struggle on a little bit further. I don't think that game is 100% gone, but it's pretty far gone. First hand has no white mana, it just has to be a mulligan. This second hand is kind of weak as well. Sorry, let me zoom back on that for a second. Or not. Okay. This second hand is pretty awkward as well. So if your opponent plays turn 1 Dork and you path to exile it, that just converts their Dork into a land, which is pretty darn good when they're on the play. This could technically get to a Sanctum Prelate on 4, but probably not before the opponent can just cast a lethal natural order, and Cataclysm is not going to be good on a mull to 6 when you're on the draw, and are probably not going to have anything left in play post-Cataclysm. The Elves deck often rebuilds faster than you do, and sometimes I don't even board in Cataclysm for the Elves matchup. So I don't think this one gets there on the draw. And this is where we see yet another mulligan. And unfortunately, we see the Lotus Petal problem of playing multiple Karakas. So I often play with 2 Karakas in my Death and Taxes decks, and that's a more conservative choice than most people make. Because every time one of these situations happened, it is just utterly gut-wrenching, feel bad. And if he doesn't draw another land in 2 or 3 turns, it just probably results in a loss for having too many copies of Karakas in your deck. Now, Karakas is obviously a great Magic card, and then there's other times where you face down an early Grizzlebrand and you're like, and it totally redeems itself. The Thoughtseize takes Mother of Runes, meaning there's not an easy turn 1 play. Luckily, there is another land here, meaning that it's going to be okay to go and play things out. What the opponent has here is a fair opening. The Collector Oof stops some of the worst case scenarios for them, but we're just allowed to develop here. So a lot of things happen relatively quickly there. Containment Priest got played out, it got Assassin's Trophy, that gave us another land, and things are okay now. Opponent has used a handful of resources. They have something in play that's hateful. We have something in play and hateful, but we also have a piece of protection and a piece of removal. So if the Death and Taxes player draws hot here, because the opponent didn't have a combo-oriented start, there's a good chance that they can steal this game. Another source to plowshares is great. The Spirit of Labyrinth crashes in, and we'll probably see a removal spell on the elf here. Again, mana being more important than anything else right now. And again, we want to fire off removal spells as soon as possible. And the opponent casting Thoughtseize, so we get like a virtual extra card by casting the Path to Exile in response is pretty hot. And speaking of hot, drawing Jitte off the top is one of the absolute best possible things that could happen here. And remember where I said getting lucky is sometimes the Death and Taxes player's way to win this matchup? That's a great example of drawing hotter than the sun. That the extra land was necessary. Those removal spells ended up being very, very good and important. You know, one fewer removal spell, and that Collector Oof sits in play, and Jitte is no longer an out. The Spirit of the Labyrinth might have stopped Glimpse-based shenanigans. Jitte got online, invalidating creatures. Then Grafdigger's Cage gets online. You cannot ask for more here, and sometimes this is what it takes to win the Elves matchup. You need to get lucky. If the opponent had a like turn 2 or turn 3 glimpse turn instead, or like some other way to just like combo quickly or produce a natural order quickly, the Death and Taxes player usually dies. But we take these. We absolutely take these. Okay, this is the final round that I want to take a look at, and this is versus Anurag, who is on a 4-color Hullbreacher control deck. This deck is playing a bunch of Haymakers at 3 mana. It has Narset and Hullbreacher, as well as Days Undoing, which is a draw 7 that works really well if you have either of those 2 cards in play. It has Oko, it has Uro, it has Teferi at CMC2, it has Dreadhorde Arcanist. So this deck just has a pile of answer it or die things, and let's see how this one plays out. This is a great opening hand with an Ether Vial here. That's how you're looking to start with Death and Taxes. And it resolves. Fantastic. A Mother of Runes into a Spirit of Labyrinth off file is a very strong start against a control deck. Okay, so we're probably just going to see a pass the turn here. Rishadan Port, try to get a Mom to, untap and do its thing. With Anurag just passing the turn on 2 mana, though, it's pretty unlikely that this Mom works, but it does! Fantastic. Alright, a second Vial hits play, and now we're going to see the Spirit of the Labyrinth off the Vial have the potential to get a blowout. Notably here, we do see an early Silent Clearing in this hand, and Silent Clearing plus Rishadan Port as a mana sink every turn is pretty awkward. Just as awkward as Spirit of the Labyrinth sniping a Ponder. You love to see it as the Death and Taxes player. So notably, that Vial is going to stay at 2 for a turn. And things are looking good for the Taxes player here. So Silent Clearing, maybe not the best card in the face of Hullbreacher, just by the way. Just throwing that out there. Alright. So EronRelentless is now building a relatively strong board presence. And we see that he's going for a Sword of Fire and Ice play here. Just looking to get in, do a bunch of damage. That's very understandable. So this is a Lightning Axe worth of value plus killing Hullbreacher. Notably, the Sword of Fire and Ice plus Spirit of the Labyrinth, not exactly a wombo combo. Alright, so the Spirit of the Labyrinth is saved. And things are looking good. Why do I say that? Well, because, like, there's just lethal damage on board. Equipping the sword, 5 plus 3 plus 2 is dead. Plus, you can also just kill the Teferi with Stoneforge Mystic to add insult to injury. So, just pausing things for a second. This is how Death and Taxes wants to win a matchup like this one. You want to take early dominating board presence, oftentimes using either Vial or Mother of Runes to stick something either ahead of schedule or stick it and make it harder to get rid of. And you don't want your opponent to make it to the point where they can just deploy Haymaker after Haymaker after Haymaker undisrupted. And this early aggressive start ended the game on turn 6, and that's fantastic. Anurag here likely has some very good cards in hand, just kind of given the card quality of his deck, so killing him before he gets to deploy a bunch of those good cards seems like a great plan. Alright, this is a one-lander, which is probably not going to fly. I don't know that I would have kept this second hand. So this second hand needs a white source in order to be functional, and it does not have something like an Ether Vial that allows you to cheat on the white mana. Something to keep in mind is that most Death and Taxes decks are playing 8 colorless lands, 4 Rishadan Ports, 4 Wastelands. Now, 2 of those are in hand. So this means that there are still 6 land cards in deck that do not produce colored mana. And that can be a little bit spooky. So there is a good portion of the time here where you don't actually hit your colored land and your opponent just makes it to turn 3 and 4 without you doing anything other than like Rishadan porting them. And if your hand looks like this and all you've done is Rishadan port your opponent when they get to like turn 4 and can play a Planeswalker through Rishadan port, this like this hand doesn't feel like it's set up for success despite having a good mix of lands and spells. I would have considered going to 5 here, but I can understand the greedy keep on the draw. Now, all of that was to talk about the Mulligan decision, not about the fantastic top deck, but unfortunately, a force of will, like, takes away that moment of little victory. By the way, if you want to learn about the math of, like, how good is it to actually keep this and how likely are you to hit the land, you want to look into what's called a hypogeometric calculator. Sorry, hypergeometric calculator. Now, luckily, Aaron Relentless does rip the planes, and that means that he can play a functional game. Unfortunately, 2 of his best cards are white-white, but at least he can start deploying cards. The Mother of Runes here as the play makes a lot of sense. If the opponent just has a removal spell, like, say, Swords to Plowshares, you want that to happen on the Mother of Rune, not on, like, the actual threat or lock piece. Alright. Narset finds Day's Undoing. That means that this is a turn where, like, Narset needs to be answered or equivalent, or things get very bad. Spirit of the Labyrinth, luckily, means that, like, the Day's Undoing is not doing the thing that it traditionally would want to be doing. So EE blows that up, but luckily a Skyclave Apparition can now take out the Narset so that it's not a one-sided draw 7. So this is the stage of the game where, to put it nicely, shit's scary. Anurag now has a good amount of mana, and he can just keep playing these Haymaker cards one after another after another. And this is probably about the point where it becomes exceptionally difficult to come back. Notably, Aaron Relentless is choosing to hold this council's judgment for something that's a little bit more scary. While the Narset is annoying if there's another day's undoing, it's not actually winning the game, whereas a Dreadhorde Arcanist or an Oko would be. And I think that's a good play. The issue here is that after answering Oko, there's still 6 power on board. And that's going to add up quickly. Anurag still has 5 cards. This game's probably out of reach at this point. But we'll see. Don't think this is a point where you concede, especially in a premier event, because matches like these often come down to the clock. Or at least they get to the point where people start having less time to think about their decisions because the clock is a true concern. So eking out, you know, even another 30 seconds out of the opponent definitely has some value. Notably, though, this is only true if you're ahead on clock, and is also probably only true if you don't have ether vials in play, because you have to manually click on your ether vials every turn cycle. And when you're sub 5 minutes on the clock, you start to really notice that add up. So Aaron Relentless is deterministically dead on board right now, but we're still going to see him take a few more game actions to eke a couple more seconds off of the clock. I would have cheekily Rashad imported the Flooded Strand here as well. Okay. Um, this is a pretty solid opening hand, and I don't think I've talked about this yet. So I'm just going to take an opportunity to talk about Swords to Plowshares for a second. So, in previous metagames, it's often been correct to side out your Swords to Plowshares versus the control decks. You know, if you think about like old school matches versus blue white miracles, unless they had Monastery Mentor, like you don't really have good targets for Swords to Plowshares in most cases. But a lot of times, the control decks of any nature now still have threats that are super, super relevant. Sometimes they're just cards that snowball on their own, like Uro or Dreadhorde Arcanist. Sometimes they're cards that are part of a combo, like Hull Breacher, and sometimes they're answers to your own cards, an Ice Fang Coatl or a Plague Engineer, for example. And you can't really get away with just cutting all of your Swords to Plowshares versus most control decks anymore. Like that plan is just not going to work out since the creatures are just so powerful. So this is a fine opening hand. It's not like absolute top tier or anything like that, but it has a good set of cards available here. I do like playing a 2-drop on this turn cycle so that you can both do a 2-drop and Mother of Runes on the following turn cycle. While theoretically, like there's a world where you want to use Mother of Runes as like the bait spell for removal spells, being able to be the first one to start double spelling in a game of Magic is often very relevant. All right, so Teferi does something interesting to this game state where it kind of forces the Stoneforge Mystic to attack and finish that thing off. Because one of the worst things that can happen versus a control deck is you go, I don't need to kill that Planeswalker when you actually did. And this is a great example of that happening in practice. Yes, Terminus is in this deck too. It's got a little bit of everything. So now this is sort of an unfortunate point where playing the Sword of Fire and Ice onto an empty board and only porting once still allows them to play a 3-drop, so it probably ends up being better to just Rishadan port twice. And this is the first of many times this match we're going to see the Rishadan porting being spread out between two different phases so that the mana empties. This is normally an important skill, but it's especially important here because of the flash threats like Hull Breacher that exist. And if you just port the opponent twice in, say, the upkeep, and then they use the mana to cast a Hull Breacher, you didn't really do much. But if you make them float 1 mana in their upkeep, then they go to their draw step, you port again, and then they cast a Hull Breacher, you really caused them to use 4 mana rather than 3. So spreading out the mana between phases can be pretty strong. Okay, there we see a Source of Plowshares on Hull Breacher, which is a totally fine play. There is a world, though, where that's actually supposed to happen on the opponent's turn instead in order to play around Force of Negation. But if you do that, then it does allow them to do things like Brainstorm and look for a way to counter it, so I don't think that matters all that much in the grand scheme of things. Notice the amount of like fear and respect here of the 3 drops that the opponent could have. So Aaron Relentless has a Sword of Fire and Ice, which is most certainly a card that he wants to have in play at some point. But the opponent's planeswalkers and threats are just so scary that trying to keep them bottlenecked on mana is priority number 1 right now. Now, this Recruiter of the Guard is great. All right, YouTube, it's time for your favorite game. What do I fetch with the Recruiter of the Guard? All right, hopefully you've had time to think about your answer. We're going to see what Aaron Relentless does, and then I'll talk about what I would have done, because they're two different things here. Aaron Relentless goes for a Stoneforge Mystic. Now, why is this the sort of card that you might want to do? Stoneforge Mystic is a card that cantrips. You know, your opponent doesn't have a counterspell right now, and you're pretty sure of that because Recruiter of the Guard is at least a 2-for-1, if not more. And I think it's totally fine to want to get a cantripping effect here. But I really would have been thinking about a Flicker Wisp personally. So if you play Flicker Wisp and you recruit the guard, you get a cantripping effect, but you have the possibility of keeping the chain going or getting a card that you need right now. I'm not super in love with Stoneforge Mystic. The rationale behind Stoneforge Mystic is probably trying to put this Sword of Fire and Ice in uncounterably, but you probably just confirmed that your opponent doesn't have Force of Will, and so I don't know that I love this line. Again, I don't think it's a bad line, but while my opponent is tapped out and like I know they can't have removal up, and I'm pretty darn sure they don't have Force of Will, I think I like generating my Flicker Wisp value here. One of the upsides of getting a 2-drop, though, is that you do get 2 Rishadan Port. So now Stoneforge Mystic represents 2 different things. It represents a clock in Batterskull, as well as like evasion and protection via Sword of Fire and Ice. Luckily, the Skyclave apparition still exists to take out the Oko. I'm not really exaggerating much when I say that, like, you really only get 1, maybe 2 turns to answer these snowballing cards before they just take over the game and things are over. Aaron Relentless choosing to really stay on the Rishadan Port train and try to keep the opponent from doing things that matter. All right. Now, I wanna talk about what I'm thinking about right here. It might look like your board presence is fine here, but if I was Aaron Relentless, I would be terrified out of my freaking mind right now because of how disastrous a sweeper like Terminus or Supreme Verdict would be. If my opponent wipes my board here, and then I give them a 3/3 and a 2/2, I have nothing, and they have 5 power available. And the only body that I've got in the tank here is this Batterskull. And so an Oko, maybe even just a removal spell, probably turns this game into a tempo situation where Anurag can stop playing a hard control role and can shift to, I'm just going to remove this germ every time that it hits play, and I will kill you in 3, 4 turns, something of that general nature. So notice this first piece of equipment that we've had since, I don't know, turn 3, 4, I forget exactly, has been sitting in hand because it's so important to Rishadenport. And this Batterskull, similarly, is probably going to be sitting in hand for a little while. And the point where he deploys one of these is the point where he probably has to give up on the Rishadenport plan. So things are complicated. Again, we notice the splitting of Rishadenport activations between different phases. Donarog is head on cards, and something really cool happened in this turn cycle. So EronRelentless set a stop in his draw step, and in his draw step, he is porting down the plains. This allows him to go and make sure that if he taps out for Sword of Fire and Ice and equip this turn, that the creature will that will happen safely. And I think that's totally a legit line. And indeed, the Swords of Plowshare was in Anurag's hand. Now we do see the Sword of Fire and Ice. We're going to see an equip. But we're not going to see an equip. Interesting. Guess I should talk about that. So, in choosing to Rishadenport, this is just a continued respect for the 3 drops that might be on the other side of the table, and I can totally respect that line. However, the Swords to Plowshares, or sorry, the Rishadenport, in order to try and get Swords to Plowshares offline for this turn cycle, was a line that indicated aggression to me. That, like, this was the turn where I'm going to shift from my current plan to my new plan. And if the plan wasn't just to go and get in there this turn, the Rishadenport didn't necessarily need to happen in this turn cycle in the draw step. And instead, this is something that could have been done in the opponent's upkeep or draw step as well in the following turn cycle. And then the turn before you actually make the critical attack where you go for it is the time that you want to make sure you're cutting them off of all of the mana. All right. So now things are spooky. The opponent has a relatively powerful card in hand, and so we're probably going to see a chump block from Anurag this turn. And here looks like we're probably going to see a mistake. All right. So what just happened? So that elk on the other side of the table blocked Skyclave Apparition, which was a 4/4 due to the presence of the sword. And Aaron Relentless, probably kind of on, well, I should say potentially on autopilot here, goes and moves that piece of equipment to another creature, which gives the opponent a token. Now, why is this probably a mistake? We know that Swords to Plowshares is in the opponent's graveyard, so the opponent can go and attack with Dreadhorde Arcanist and then go ahead and exile this. So moving this here isn't actually representing killing Dreadhorde Arcanist at all, unfortunately. So I think this was a time where he just wasn't thinking about the damage that had been dealt to his creature and what happens if he moves the piece of equipment. And this is a bit of a blow on tempo. So there is 6 incoming damage this turn that also ends up removing Recruiter of the Guard. And this is now a very, very spooky spot to be in. Another Recruiter of the Guard off the top, though, is an absolutely brilliant draw. Oh, sorry. I forgot to play the game of what do we get, YouTube, but like you just have to answer the 2019 or 2020 card when it's presented. It's not that much of a game. So Aaron Relentless has this sword, which is pretty good. Anurag has another chump block here due to Containment Priest before he can start drawing cards with it. So this isn't necessarily a game over scenario yet by any stretch of the imagination. But things are going to start to get a little bit more complicated here. And at some point, Aaron Relentless is probably going to have to cave and just cast this Batter Skull. But we're not quite there yet. The Narset represents some scary things that can happen in the not too distant future. And that's the scariest. So now there's the question of, do you kill the Narset or do you just start going to face? I think the Narset's got to go here. That's a very threatening card. And once again, there is a situation here where a sweeper is disastrous, but Spirit of the Labyrinth is pretty strong. Unfortunately, Anurag refueled in the previous turn cycle. So we're likely to see land plus snowbally 3-drop of some nature come down. That's indeed what happens. Now Spirit of the Labyrinth is off, and life is not exactly fantastic. Okay, so there's an interesting decision made here. So Aaron Relentless has a Swords of Plowshares in hand, and he can use it on this 3/3 illusion token, and then crash in safely with the Spirit of the Labyrinth on Oko. And that's pretty cool and all, but this maybe doesn't get him anywhere. So he does that. He gets one attack in on Oko. Oko goes to 2. Oko pluses again, probably turning the Astrolabe into another Elk, and then he's kind of empty. So if this Swords to Plowshares isn't going to like really accomplish something that kills the Oko, it does make sense to save it for something like a Dreadhorde Arcanist that will maybe take over the game. And this is playing towards yet another copy of Skyclave Apparition, or maybe a Council's Judgment or Cataclysm that can answer the Oko. We're not quite at this point yet, but it's starting to get to the point where the clock is likely to become a concern with this game. Both players are still at about 20 life. Both players have a respectable board presence. So unless there's a sweeper or something that resets this board, this game probably goes on for a while. All right, so now now Aaron Relentless has some okay attacks, but the presence of these illusions is a little bit spooky. And the double chump block here, unfortunately, means that something like a Terminus is probably in the future. And this is probably a pivotal point in the game where this sweeper has happened. Anurag has an unchecked Oko plus a token, and now life is bad. Now he's kind of in the situation where if he doesn't draw an answer to this Oko, Anurag's remaining cards end up burying him very, very quickly. With 2 dead cards in hand and a Swords to Plowshares that's relatively weak, life's not the best. Notably, Anurag is not going for maximum aggression here by just plussing on the Astrolabe. All right, there's an answer to Oko. Life is fantastic. So the Rashadan Port game gets to continue for a little while longer. Notably, a silent clearing would have done a lot of damage to himself this game. Okay, so we see yet another 3-mana Haymaker. This one is a little bit less scary right now. It's kind of just getting some redraws by bouncing Astrolabe, but it does represent some spooky stuff in the future. The plus ability allows him to cast sorceries at instant speed, and notably Days Undoing is a sorcery. So Anurag is probably pulling ahead in this game slowly here, but Anurag is also down about 2 minutes on time. So given the life total issues here, it's probably about time to use the Swords to Plowshares on that illusion and stop holding out for something better. This game just needs to be stretched on a little bit longer if he's going to win. Notice here that he is holding some lands back, and this is because of Cataclysm. If he Cataclysms here and leaves Anurag with one land and a 2/2 illusion, like, life is probably good, and he can probably win from that position. Unfortunately, another answer means that life is a little rough. Anurag is down a lot on clock, but with 5 power in play, that's just 3 turns. And here it is, the instant speed Days Undoing that I mentioned might happen a little bit earlier. And so Anurag gets a fresh hand while picking up 7 treasures. And this is effectively the end. The game isn't over this turn, but Aaron Relentless is taking 5 damage this turn, going down to 4, and Anurag gets like a fistful of new cards. It's basically like Cataclysm or maybe Recruiter of the Guard or bust here. Otherwise, the game is just over, and that's that. GG's all around. All right, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed commenting on it. If you did, please like the video, and if you're really enjoying the legacy content, please consider doing something to support me, whether that's, subscribing to the channel, doing a donation deck list, or trying to fund one of the other cool projects that I do. If you're interested in me doing some commentary on some of your Death and Taxes games, hit me up via email or something like that. My contact information is available on my website, and there's a link to that in the video description. Have a great rest of the day, folks.